The house was too quiet when Mark was away. Clara used to count the days until his return, but after 3 years of his constant business trips, the silence had become a second skin. She wandered through their empty farmhouse, the ticking clock her only company. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the pasture where their donkey, Danny, grazed lazily. She sighed, pressing her forehead against the kitchen window. Another week alone. Another week of pretending she wasn't drowning in absence. That evening, she carried a bucket of feed to the barn, her boots crunching on dry earth. Danny lifted his head at her approach, ears twitching forward. "Hungry, boy?" she murmured, pouring the grain into his trough. He nudged her arm gently, his dark eyes warm and knowing. She scratched behind his ears, smiling despite herself. Back inside, she dialed Mark's number. His voicemail greeted her, again. "Just checking in," she said to the silence. "Call me when you can." The disconnect settled heavily in her chest. Later, as she tossed in bed, the wind howled outside. A branch snapped against the roof. Danny's distressed bray sent her rushing to the barn in her nightgown. Rain lashed at her face as she slid the door shut behind her. He stood trembling in his stall. "Shoo, it's okay," she whispered, pressing her cheek to his neck. His heartbeat steadied beneath her palm. In the dim lantern light, Clara brushed Danny's coat, the rhythm soothing her frayed nerves. He exhaled deeply, leaning into her touch. "You're better company than him," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Guilt prickled, but Danny's quiet presence was a balm. Days blurred. She began lingering in the barn, telling Danny about her childhood, her frustrations, things she'd never voiced to Mark. He listened, his ears flicking attentively. One afternoon, as she rested against his side, his muzzle brushed her hair. A laugh bubbled up, until she realized she'd been holding her breath. That night, she dreamed of running through fields, Danny beside her, Mark's voice calling from somewhere far behind. She woke with a start, her skin feverish. The barn loomed outside her window, silhouetted by moonlight. At dawn, Clara avoided the pasture, scrubbing dishes until her hands were raw. But when Danny's lonely bray carried through the air, her resolve cracked. She peered out the window. He stood at the fence, watching the house. Waiting. Her pulse thundered. This was absurd. Dangerous. Yet as the coffee cooled in her cup, she found herself reaching for the carrot she'd saved from last night's dinner. Clara told herself it was just a silly habit, bringing Danny an apple each morning, staying to stroke his velvety nose before chores. But when she caught herself humming as she approached the barn, her chest fluttered with something warmer than routine. The donkey's ears perked at the sound of her footsteps, and he ambled to the gate, nudging her pocket for his treat. Greedy, she teased, but her fingers lingered in his mane. The morning sun painted his gray coat in gold, and for a breath, she forgot the empty farmhouse behind her. Mark's calls grew shorter. "Still in Denver," he'd say, voice tinny through the phone. "Maybe home Friday." Clara stopped asking which Friday. Instead, she filled notebooks with thoughts she couldn't voice, pages about Danny's quiet patience, the way he rested his chin on her shoulder as if he understood. One evening, wine-loosened and reckless, she read the entries aloud to him. His warm breath tickled her neck as she whispered, "Sometimes I think you're the only one who sees me." The admission hung between them, terrifying and true. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling the scent of hay and earth. When she pulled back, Danny's eyes held a depth that made her stomach twist. The next day, she avoided the barn entirely, scrubbing floors until her knees ached. But at dusk, Danny's insistent braying drew her outside. He stood at the fence, tail flicking. "You're not supposed to," her voice broke. He stretched his neck toward her, lips brushing her wrist. A laugh escaped her, high and unsteady. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. Yet when she pressed her palm to his cheek, his eyelashes fluttered closed. Her own breathing echoed in her ears. That night, she dreamt of running through the pasture, Danny's hooves pounding beside her, Mark's voice fading behind them. She woke gasping, the sheets tangled around her legs. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, painting a silver path to the window and the barn beyond. At dawn, Clara stood at the pasture gate, dew-soaking her slippers. Danny trotted to her, nostrils flaring. She reached out, then snatched her hand back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Mark's name flashed on the screen, flights delayed. Home tomorrow. The wind carried Danny's soft knicker as she turned toward the house. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Tomorrow, everything would change. The crunch of gravel under tires startled Clara from her thoughts. She stood frozen at the kitchen sink, soap suds dripping from her hands as Mark's rental car rolled into the driveway. Danny, grazing near the fence, lifted his head and brayed, a sound that now felt like an accusation. Mark stepped out, stretching with the weary ease of a man who still thought this was just another return. His smile when he saw her in the doorway was automatic, practiced. "Hey, you," he said, leaning in for a kiss. Clara turned her face at the last second, his lips brushing her cheek instead. "You hungry?" she asked, too quickly, already retreating into the kitchen. She felt his gaze linger on her back, but he didn't follow. Through the window, she watched Danny watching them, his ears twitching toward the house. Dinner was silent except for the clink of silverware. Mark talked about Denver, about the deal that had taken so long. Clara nodded, pushing peas across her plate. "You okay?" he asked finally. "You seem off." "Just tired," she said. But when she looked up, his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in that detached curiosity he used on problematic clients. It made her skin prickle. Later, in bed, he reached for her. Clara stiffened, then forced herself to relax. His hands felt wrong, too smooth, too impatient. When he kissed her neck, she closed her eyes and saw dusty fur and liquid brown eyes. Mark pulled back. "Jesus, Clara. Are you even here?" The question hung between them. Somewhere outside, Danny brayed again, long and mournful. Mark sat up, running a hand through his hair. "What's going on with you?" Clara stared at the ceiling. The truth pressed against her teeth, absurd and damning. She swallowed it down. "Nothing," she lied. "Just not in the mood." Next morning, Clara found Mark in the barn. He was standing by Danny's stall, arms crossed. The donkey eyed him warily, ears flat. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," Mark said without turning around. Clara's pulse jumped. "He needs care. You know that." Mark finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. He held up her notebook, the one she'd left in the hayloft. Pages fluttered open to yesterday's entry. "His eyes understand me in ways no human ever has." For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then Mark laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Clara lunged for the book, but he held it away. Danny shifted uneasily, his hooves scraping straw. "Mark, it's not what?" His voice went dangerously quiet. "Not real? Because this reads like a goddamn romance novel." He flipped another page. Asterisk his warmth feels more honest than any touch I've ever, asterisk Christ, Clara. The notebook hit the wall. Danny reared back, knocking over a bucket with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot. They faced each other in the kitchen, the air between them charged. "I want him gone," Mark said. Clara's hands clenched. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" He leaned across the table. "Then look me in the eye and tell me there's nothing going on." The words died in her throat. She thought of Danny's head on her shoulder, of secrets whispered into coarse fur. Mark exhaled sharply. "That's what I thought." He grabbed his keys. "I'll be at the motel. When I come back, that animal better be gone. Or I am." The door slammed. Through the window, Clara watched his car disappear down the road. In the sudden silence, she became aware of a sound, Danny, calling for her from the barn. A sound that was, she realized with dawning horror, the only one she truly wanted to hear. The ending propels the story toward its final reckoning while maintaining emotional plausibility. Would you like any adjustments to the pacing or dialogue? Clara paced the barn aisle, her boots kicking up dust that swirled in the late afternoon light. Danny stood motionless in his stall, watching her with that quiet intensity that now felt like a second heartbeat. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the contact she hadn't dialed in years, * Jenny, Equestrian Center star. 3 rings, then a cheerful voice, looking to board? How much for a donkey? Clara's voice cracked. A pause. Seriously? Just, give me a number. When she hung up, the figure Jenny quoted echoed in her skull. * 6 months of grocery money. A flight to see Mark's parents. A divorce lawyer's retainer. * Danny nudged her shoulder, his breath warm through her shirt. She pressed her forehead to his. I can't, she whispered. But his eyelashes brushed her cheek, and suddenly she was sobbing into his neck, her fingers tangled in his mane like a lifeline. Outside, a car door slammed. Clara froze. Mark was back early. He stood in the barn doorway, silhouetted by the setting sun. Well? Clara wiped her face with her sleeve. I found a place for him. Mark stepped closer. Good. His gaze flicked to Danny, then back to her. You're really okay with this? The question hung between them, heavy as a struck gong. Clara opened her mouth, but what came out was, do you even know why I love him? Mark blinked. Clara, it's a donkey, no. Her voice surprised them both, clear, certain. He listens. He's here. When was the last time you looked at me without checking your phone? Mark's jaw tightened. So this is my fault? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He turned toward the house, then stopped. Jenny's picking him up tomorrow. Be done with this. Danny's tail swished. A fly buzzed. Somewhere, a horse whinnied in the next pasture. The ordinary sounds of a world that refused to pause for her unraveling. Clara didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., she crept to the barn with a blanket and a bottle of wine. Danny nickered when she slid into his stall. She curled against his side, the wine bitter on her tongue. Remember that storm? She murmured. His ear twitched toward her voice. You were scared. I was scared. Stupid, huh? The stars wheeled overhead through the hayloft door. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. Danny's ribs rose and fell under her cheek. She thought of Mark's wedding ring glinting in the lamplight as he packed his suitcase. Thought of Jenny's trailer arriving at dawn. Thought, most of all, of how easy it would be to open the gate and let Danny disappear into the hills. But when the first pink streaks of dawn appeared, Clara held Danny's lead rope as Jenny fastened the trailer ties. He's sweet, Jenny said. We'll take good care of him. Mark watched from the porch, coffee in hand. His expression was unreadable. When the engine started, Danny brayed, a sound that clawed at Clara's ribs. She took one step forward, then another, until she was running, her hand slapping against the trailer door as it pulled away. Clara. Mark's voice behind her. She turned. His outstretched hand hovered between them, uncertain. The trailer rounded the bend, taking the dust, and Danny, with it. Clara looked at Mark's hand. Looked at the empty road. And made her choice.